Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Bedtime Stories for Grownups. Wherever you are and whatever your age is, because it's always bedtime somewhere. I'm Mikey Andrew Raymer, and I'll be your host each week, reading you around 30 minutes of stories from an unpublished book called Rivka's Sewing Machine, Modern Jewish Tales of Magic and Mystery. If you missed any past stories or want to hear them again, they are all recorded and you can get to them through the Jewish Live website. We're living in such a strange and challenging and difficult time. And when I looked at the stories initially that I was going to read today, they seemed perhaps escapist. But as I continued to read through them, I thought that the questions that they were asking about the nature of good, evil, manipulation, truth, dishonesty, actually echo into this really painful time. So I dedicate these stories in their oddness to everything that's going on, to everyone who is suffering, to everyone who is struggling, and to our hope that we are moving slowly, although I prefer quickly, to a better future. The first story is called A Witch in the Suburbs. Once there is a witch who, after long years of study, was ready to go out into the world and do his evil work. Guided by his demon mentor Trafe, this witch considered the different fields that attract modern-day dark spellcasters. He rejected the foremost one, politics, passed over journalism, television newscasting, and decided instead to pursue a more private vocation. After extensive training in the conventional world, he moved to a comfortable suburb, a short train ride from New York City, where he established himself in private practice as a psychologist. With his wall of diplomas, the elegant furnishings of his office, the little festive dinner parties he gave at his new home, and with the magnetic appeal of his compelling personality. In no time at all, Dr. Max Grossman was booked up for months in advance. I could tell you endless tales about the chaos he brought to the lives of his patients, but you would be emotionally exhausted by all of them. Instead, I will focus on one particular family, the Rosenblatts, who live in Stone Village in Nassau County on Long Island. Let's begin with Robert, the husband and father of this ordinary suburban clan. Robert was a lawyer, age 54, a partner in a well-established law firm in Manhattan. His wife, Susan, was one of the music teachers at the elementary school all three of their children went to, Mitchell, David, and Nancy. On the whole, the Rosenblatts were a happy family, and Grossman was enthusiastic about the challenge of working with them. It was the death of Mr. Rosenblatt's long-widowed mother, Sybil, who had lived with them, that sent them into therapy. The children were all very close to their grandmother, who had cooked, cleaned, and taken care of them while their parents were at work. And unlike the endless jokes and stories you hear about mothers-in-law, Susan was the daughter that Sybil Rosenblatt had never had, and the two of them were very close. Robert came to see Grossman first, shortly after his mother's death. His grief was palpable, and Grossman was comforting. In fact, he encouraged Robert's grieving, for modern-day professional witches like to play off these difficult human emotions. Although successful in his practice and satisfied with his work, Robert had always dreamed of being a painter. And while he tried to channel his creativity into his job, he felt that something was missing in his life. Rather than encouraging Robert to take up painting in his spare time, a few carefully chosen words from Grossman about how painful it must be to not have his artistic side acknowledged by his family sent Robert into a downward spiral of discontent that further eroded their family life. During that challenging period, Susan Rosenblatt began to see Dr. Grossman too. In addition to the difficulties with her husband and the loss of her beloved mother-in-law, Susan was grappling with mounting stress at work due to budget cuts, teacher firings, increased class sizes, and heightened racial conflicts. Susan was close to burnout. Grossman was highly sympathetic, especially when she began to question her husband's support. The children started seeing Grossman later, after the fights between their parents began to escalate. When, in a moment of rare agreement, husband and wife decided that the children could also use some counseling. Mitchell was an active athlete, and David spent all of his spare time playing video games. They only cooperated with each other when they were teasing their little sister Nancy. Dr. Grossman suggested the boys come up with a shared project that would be exciting to both of them. Each night at supper, Robert and Susan would help them explore their various ideas. But by the end of that season, the two were fighting more than ever. Nancy felt neglected, and all five of them would leave the table for different parts of the house, their stomachs tied in knots. Sadly, there was nothing the Rosenblatt's guiding angels could do to counter Grossman's suggestions. Dreams didn't get through to them, and neither did subliminal messages. Their heads were too filled up with witchery for them to listen. Within 6 months of starting therapy, Robert slapped Susan for the first time, spit at his younger son, lost a major court case due to his emotional distractions, and started having an affair with Noreen McElroy, a paralegal who was working in his office. Noreen was several years younger than Susan, and in addition to finding her highly attractive, Robert thoroughly enjoyed going to art openings with her in the city. Soon, he was coming home later and later, which was almost a relief to his wife and children. There was much less tension in the house when he wasn't there. As for Susan, when the head of the music department retired, she was chosen by the school board to take her place. Although it was a position she'd wanted for years, she knew that the extra work would take her further away from her marriage and children. Grossman advised her to take the job. One sentence, one spell was all that he needed. It's time to own your power, Susan. In the year that followed, Mitchell started wearing clothing that was appalling to his parents, got a tattoo of a bat on his left ass cheek, which they did not know about, and came home one day with his left eyebrow pierced. All of this could have brought Robert and Susan back into dialogue. Their angels tried to get them there, but Grossman convinced them that the boy was old enough to start making his own mistakes. As for David, he and his best friend Jamil found a way to break into the school's computer and spent hours in the Rosenblatt's basement, reading through school records and altering grades. Nancy Rosenblatt was Grossman's greatest challenge. At 10 years of age, the baby in the family, she should have been his easiest target. On the surface, she was lazy, spoiled, and inclined to temper tantrums, just the sort of child that Grossman worked best with and adored. By age 14, he expected her to be lying, stealing, doing drugs, and quite possibly selling her body. But nothing he suggested to her seemed to have the desired effect. Nancy had a mind of her own and would sometimes sit for an entire session silent on his long black leather couch, staring at him or out the window with dark eyes that even he, a master witch, could not penetrate. Just before Passover, when the Rosenblatts always cleaned house in preparation for that joyous festival, Robert announced to Susan that he was moving in with Noreen. Susan was devastated and began to see Grossman twice and then 3 times a week. Right after Passover, Mitchell was rushed to the emergency room on a drug overdose. He survived thanks to the quick intervention of his protecting angel and an excellent new resident at the hospital. The week after that, David and Jamil were caught tampering with the school's computer. Susan was distraught. Robert refused to ask one of his partners to represent the boys in juvenile court, as she had asked him to do. In fact, he told her that he wanted a divorce and informed her that he was going to terminate his relationship with the children. This was pure hell, and Grossman was delighted. Trafe was pleased with his student's progress and thought he was ready for a position of greater influence and power, perhaps working with the state government. By year's end, everyone the Rosenblatts knew was in therapy with Grossman. As their lives spiraled out of control, they all said that Max, for he encouraged his clients to call him by his first name, that Max was the only thing holding them together. The single holdout in his reign of terror was little Nancy Rosenblatt. Her continued silence seemed wonderfully hostile to Grossman, and nothing he did could push her over the edge. He was beginning to think that he had finally found his first recruit, one he could guide into the same dark mysteries that Mrs. Fishbein, his childhood piano teacher, had revealed to him back in Cleveland, where he'd grown up. Max had a conference with Trafe about Nancy. Trafe suggested that since everything was going so well, Max just sit back and let Nancy come to him. So that was his tactic. Week after week, he sat with her, often in silence or staring back at her when she stared at him. Finally, one afternoon, just before their session was about to end, Nancy snapped her bubble gum, broke her silence, and said, "Listen, why don't you cut the crap? I know who you are, and I know what you're up to." Grossman's evil heart swelled with pride. He leaned forward in his large leather swivel chair and said, laughing, "What do you mean, Nan?" She hated to be called that and glared back at him. "What I mean is exactly what I said. I can see through your disguise." Grossman smiled. This was just what he'd said to Mrs. Fishbein, with her bright red nails, sitting on the piano bench beside him, exuding a malevolence far stronger than her cheap perfume. He'd figured out what Mrs. Fishbein was, and remembering what he'd asked of her while practicing another piece by Wagner, he waited to see what Nancy would ask of him. Humans always want something from witches and demons: power, money, sex, fame, or all of them. And he was ready to savor his greatest triumph. What would a 10-year-old child want? But Nancy just stared at him. Finally, it was Grossman who broke the glassy silence. "Isn't there something you want to ask me for?" "You?" Nancy shrugged. "What could I ever want from you?" Max was puzzled. "Who do you think I am?" he asked, leering. "Well, up front, you act like some kind of saint, helpful, kind, but your advice makes everything worse. For a while, I thought you were some kind of demon, but I've seen through that disguise. You're too pathetic to be anything else but human." Grossman was distressed. Things had taken a turn he hadn't anticipated. Trembling, he did what witches are taught to do in such situations. He cast a quick spell to freeze time so that he could explore his options. Grossman reviewed the regulations of his order, went over the terms of the contract he'd signed with Trafe, and decided upon a new tactic. He would scare Nancy into submission by telling her how sick she really was, how he was her last remaining hope for leading any kind of a normal life when she grew up. But Nancy spoiled it the moment he started time up again. She smiled at him and said, "Our hour is almost up, Max." Grossman panicked. That was supposed to be his line. Nothing like this had ever happened to him before, not in his studies with Trafe, and not when he was in medical school. Remembering an old witch trick he'd learned from Mrs. Fishbein, he leaned forward in his chair and said, with a diabolical grin, the one thing he knew no one would ever expect from him. What would you say, Nan, if I told you that I was a witch? I knew it, Maxie, she said, snapping the bubble gum that she always kept on the roof of her mouth when she wasn't chewing it. But don't worry, I won't let out your dirty little secret. From that day on, things took a decided downward spiral for Dr. Grossman. No matter what he did or said, no matter what Trafe suggested to him, he could not recover from that session with Nancy Rosenblatt. Was she good? Was she evil? Was she more powerful than he was? He could not tell. She had thrown him off balance, made him doubt not just his power, but the power of evil as well. And not knowing anything at all about the power of good, Max Grossman, the witch, was lost. No surprise, but from that point on, his practice suffered. His patients started remembering who they were and started getting better. And the worst part of it was they all thanked him. 6 months later, he retired. And in despair, not knowing what else to do, Trafe suggested that a change of scenery would do him good and invited him to return to an earlier interest. So Max moved out to San Francisco, and a little bit rusty at first, but drawing on everything he had learned all those years ago from Mrs. Fishbein, Max Grossman is now working nights in a cozy little piano bar south of Market Street. The Trials of an Angel. Oriel and Nicanor were drifting just below the Empyrean after morning services, warming their wings. Oriel was struggling with a different client on Earth, and it wanted to get some advice from Nicanor, who was about to start a brief service tour on the planet Quingy. This is one of my most challenging cases so far. Following the suggestions of one of his demons, he dropped out of the culinary arts program I guided him to, where he was doing research on food history. I thought that made a lot of sense since he'd majored in anthropology in college, but was working as a short order cook after he got out. I was disappointed that he left school, but decided to leave him alone for a while to sort things out for himself. When I tuned in again, much to my surprise, he was finishing up a book. I was delighted until I saw what it was titled, Recipes from Hitler's Table. And this man is a Jew, no less. Nicanor sighed. Service on Earth is always challenging. That was why it had requested a temporary transfer to Quingy. With its great physical beauty, boasting a sentient species with 7 genders that has never invented war, rape, robbery, or even anger, it's a much easier planet for angels to deal with than Earth. But it's also very low on heaven's priority list. So Nicanor was lucky to have gotten that assignment. Nicanor flared out its wings to their fullest extent and flipped over on its back so that it could warm its golden belly. Turning a blazing turquoise eye toward its companion, it said, or, I think you need to have a conference with its demon. Oriel shuddered. I hate those conferences. I know that every sentient species has its own angels and its own demons, and I know that the demons all work for God just like we do. And I know that we're not supposed to have any judgments about what they do or how they do it because it's all a part of God's overarching design. But tell me the truth, Nicanor, doesn't their odor bother you and those wings like a bat or something? Nicanor laughed. Why don't you just request a conference in non-manifestation mode, silly? Why, that's even worse, Nick. When we all look the same, I forget what their job description is, reflecting the bad and then back to them the way that our job is to reflect to them their good. And I treat them just like one of us, and then nothing gets accomplished at all. Nicanor wanted to say something about how angels, demons, and human souls all come from the same place in the heart of God and just spiral out on different paths, but decided it would be best just to remain silent. It was growing late as the two of them drifted down toward the lower levels of heaven. They could hear the choirs of cherubim still singing above them. For a time, Oriel hummed along with them. Then, as they got closer to the borders of first heaven, ready to go back to their respective jobs, Oriel turned to its companion and said, "Do you ever wish you hadn't been created?" Nicanor was silent for a moment and then said, "Of course I do. Existence is so hard. Eon after eon, watching the universe evolve so slowly, so very, very slowly. But what can we do? We can't kill ourselves like human beings can." Shuddering for a moment, Aurel turned to Nicanor and said, as if that even worked for them, they die only to discover that they're still immortal souls, and yet I envy them. For a short while, each time that they embody, they get to forget. Sometimes I laugh, Oriel. I watch them struggling to understand things, and I want to tell them, if you could see it all, if you could see the way things are, you would cherish each tiny little moment of ignorance that you have now. You'd stop struggling to understand everything. You'd revel in your unconsciousness and simply enjoy the splendors of physicality while you have the chance. You know what you mean, Nick? They have drugs, they have alcohol, they have obsessive love affairs, 1,000 different things to numb them out for a while. I wish that we did. That's the worst part of being an angel. We can never forget. Well, what's your client's book about? Is it any good? Nicanor asked. They'd had the same discussion too many times before over the millions of years since they'd been created. Well, that's the problem. It's fascinating. It's a vegetarian cookbook. I didn't know, did you, that the two most famous vegetarians in recent Earth history were Adolf Hitler and Mahatma Gandhi? Well, that just proves my point, Oriel. Everything is connected. Yeah, but that's what I wish I could forget. Nicanor sighed. Oriel groaned. Then, trailing clouds of opalescent light behind them, they turned, merged bodies fully for a moment, and then, shouting psalms of glory, they burst apart and soared off in opposite directions down to their respective work planets. The last story is called The Curse. And looking at the clock, I realize I may go over a little bit the half hour, so you can indulge me or you can go to yoga class or whatever. The Curse. Once upon a time, twin sisters were born who were so alike in every way that after they were cleaned up, neither their mother, nor the doctor who delivered them, or the nurse in the delivery room could tell which was the firstborn and which the second. Bessie and Tessie Moskowitz grew up in a crowded tenement apartment in the Lower East Side with their older brothers Jaime and Sheldon and Morris. Although they had to share a tiny room and even a bed, the twins did not like to wear the same clothes or get the same haircuts, didn't like to spend time together, and never had the same friends. Because they'd been that way since birth, their parents and siblings accepted it. When other people commented on it, the rest of the Moskowitz family would shrug and say, "Who can figure out the twins?" They went through grade school and high school where Tessie was courted by a boy named Irving and Bessie was spending time with a boy named Abe. Tessie's Irving was a shy and gentle boy, and so it was Abe who proposed to Bessie first. When Bessie announced her engagement at the supper table, Tessie pecked her sister on the cheek, offered her congratulations, and went off to their closet of a room. There is a special power that connects twins. Most twins are close, but that connection is there even if they aren't. Jealous that her sister was going to be married before her, Tessie tapped into the magic that twin energy is and put a curse on her sister. She knew intuitively that she couldn't kill her, so she did the next best thing, next worst thing. She willed her twin to get sick. Very, very sick. And several days later, while washing the dishes, Bessie collapsed at the sink, unconscious. She fell into a coma, and nothing the doctors did could revive her. Abe, her parents, and brothers were heartbroken. After a year of near mourning had gone by with daily visits to the hospital where Bessie lay unconscious, Irving asked Tessie to marry him. Naturally, she accepted, and wanting to feel some joy again, Tessie's parents gave her a big wedding. Tessie and Irving got a little apartment in Brooklyn. Irving worked as a pharmacist, and Tessie stayed home to raise Sheila and Bernie and then Arnold. At first, Abe went to see his fiancée, Bessie, every weekend. Then it was every other weekend, once a month. And after she'd been in a coma for 3 years, he stopped coming altogether, met someone else, and eventually married her. Her parents came on the train to visit her once a month, her brothers less often, and Tessie never came at all. But once they got married themselves, her brothers moved away and stopped coming to see her. Year after year after year, poor Bessie lay between life and death in the Jewish home upstate that her family put her in. And after her parents died, no one ever came to see her again. But curses, as you know, cannot go on forever. This one was time limited like all the rest. Many years later, in a hospital in Miami, in a private room with around-the-clock nurses of her own, surrounded by children and grandchildren, Tessie breathed her last breath. And at the very same moment, in a dank and cheerless, understaffed nursing home in the Catskills, Bessie coughed, sighed, turned, groaned, and came out of her coma. What an amazing thing it was after more than 50 years for Bessie Moskowitz to awaken from her cursed sleep. The story made the news across the nation. A medical miracle, it seemed. Nieces and nephews who had never heard of their Aunt Bessie all flocked to her side. Bruce, the eldest son of her brother Morris, who'd made a fortune in real estate, had her taken by ambulance to a large new hospital in Westchester. Fancy, she called it as they wheeled her to a private room with a beautiful view of the Hudson River. For weeks they ran tests on her, wanting to see what her condition was, wanting to see if they could find out anything about her awakening that could be of use to other coma patients. Social workers helped her deal with the fact that all of her friends, her immediate family, her fiancé were long gone. Physical therapists helped her to strengthen muscles that had atrophied from doing nothing for 5 decades. There was much to catch up with. Bessie was amazed at how the world had changed, that you could fly across the country in hours, that there had been men on the moon, that no one listened to the radio anymore, but watched private movies and all kinds of other things on boxes they kept in every room. All of that amazed her. Finally, the day came when Bessie was ready to leave the hospital. Her nephew Bruce and his wife Francine had invited her to come live with them. As Bruce led her to the elevator, he warned her that the parking lot was swarming with reporters from television, magazines, and newspapers.
Crazy about that.
Bessie was amazed when she saw them all. What do they think? She asked. That I'm some kind of movie star? Not just a lady who should be dead?
Now it's nice, yeah. Oh, good.
I paused because someone is talking in the background. And I tried to mute everyone, but that seems to not have worked. So I shall continue with apologies. Finally, the day came when Bessie was ready to leave the hospital. Her nephew Bruce and his wife Francine had invited her to come live with them. As Bruce led her to the elevator, he warned her that the parking lot was swarming with reporters from television, magazines, and newspapers. Bessie was amazed when she saw them all. What do they think? She asked. That I'm some kind of movie star, not just a lady who should be dead? Bruce laughed and steered her through the lobby and out to the waiting horde of reporters and ordinary people who wanted to see the miracle twin, as she was now called. Bessie answered all their questions, signed autographs. A movie contract was handed to her. Bruce took it. A publisher wanted to do a book. A health magazine wanted to interview her. Finally, feeling her weaken on his arm, Bruce interrupted one of the reporters and said, "You'll have to excuse us now. My aunt is very tired. After all, this is her first day out in more than half a century." Everyone laughed and the crowd began to disperse. As Bruce helped her into his car, a famous television anchor approached her and asked, "Miss Moskowitz, what are you going to do today?" As she settled back in the car, she said, smiling, "You can read about it in the paper." Bruce knew that she wanted to see New York again. She wanted to walk on her own block from way back when. She wanted to eat some blintzes, buy a new dress, and take a long, hot bath with no nurses anywhere. She wanted to sit by herself in front of a mirror, just to stare at her own strange face, 50 years older than it was when she collapsed, and what to her felt like a very long sleep. She wanted to cry over all the deaths and losses, and she wanted to laugh at being resurrected in a world where her nasty twin sister was dead and gone. Bruce and Francine lived in a fancy house on Long Island. "With a room of my own?" Bessie said in disbelief when Bruce told her about it. "Two if you want them," he said. "In fact, the whole top floor to yourself, now that both the girls are off to college." There was much to get used to. That very morning, Bessie had watched a segment about herself on television, but it was like hearing about someone else. And the world was a stranger to her also, with strange new countries and strange new diseases. As they headed through traffic, with reporters following their car, Bessie was amazed by all the traffic and the speed. She gripped the car door, comforted by her seatbelt. As they got closer to the city, she was thrilled and startled to see the skyline so different from the one that she remembered. As Bruce headed toward Midtown, she kept and eyeing all the new buildings so tall, and the crowds, the cars, the noise, the dirt. It was almost too much for her. Finally, being contained was too much for Bessie. She wanted to get out, to walk, to breathe the air again. Bruce pulled over on Fifth Avenue right near Washington Square Park. It was an early day in June. "It's gorgeous," Bruce said as he parked. Bessie thought the cloudless sky looked strange, so gray, not blue, and thought, remembering how the park looked the last time she'd been there, was also different. There was litter everywhere. And as she tried to open the car door, Bessie was startled when two girls sailed by on rollerblades, and then a third one, practically naked. As they zipped away, a strange-looking man with metal rings in his nose and lips walked by screaming, "Get away!" Bruce snapped at him, coming around the car. He took Aunt Bessie by the arm and they walked into the park. It was familiar to Bessie, and yet nothing was familiar. "In my day, you could drive right onto the arch," Bessie said as they walked toward the memorial to George Washington. "And what happened to it? It looks terrible," Bessie asked as they stood beside it. When Bruce told her that polluted air had eaten away the hard stone like acid, had melted Washington's features away, Bessie shuddered. Just then, a little boy on a tricycle called out, "Look, it's the miracle twin!" His mother turned, and so did several other people. All at once, a crowd gathered of people who recognized Bessie. They started asking her questions, wanted her autograph. "What's it like to come back? What does the world seem like? Do you like the future? Are you going to be in a movie?" Finally, the questions were too much for her, and Bruce took Bessie's arm and began to lead her back to the car. But people kept jostling, trying to get close to Bessie. "Please, please, just let us through," Bruce shouted. "My aunt is very tired." Trembling, out of breath, she slumped into the seat. As Bruce came round and got in beside her, he noticed that she was crying. "Are you all right, Aunt Bessie?" he asked, taking her hand in one of his as he hit the automatic door lock button with the other. Wiping her eyes, composing herself, Bessie said, "Such a girl that pushed into me wearing her underwear out in the street. And then a person I couldn't tell if it was a boy or a girl. And then that man who bumped into me with no one behind his eyes. Was he taking a narcotic? And the air and the dirt, oy vey, and people on wheels with little machines on their head listening to music that no one else can hear, turning in circles all by themselves, and statues that melt away and buildings too tall. The air smelling so much worse than it used to smell, and it didn't smell good even then. Oi, Brucey, this is a terrible, terrible future. I wish to God that I were still asleep, or even better, dead."